Yeah, that's me taking the bull by the horns. That's how I handle my business. It's a metaphor. But that actually happened, though.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everybody's doing well. Today we're going to be talking about something Elder Scrolls related. So, the Minotaur is probably one of Oblivion's most memorable enemy types. Hulking bullmen, swinging giant warhammers, they just are imposing figures. They can be found all across Cyrodiil, but they usually stick to forests and hills. Occasionally they can be seen observing ruins from the old Alessian Empire. This sort of hints at their true but sometimes disputed origins. Both in and out of game lore describes them as being found in other provinces across Tamriel like southern Skyrim and the Reach, but for the sake of simplicity I'm mainly sticking to the ones found in Cyrodiil, not the potential ones that could be and should be found running around with the Forsworn. So in Oblivion they come in two different sizes. The regulars, which are presumably younger and lighter in color and sometimes have a broken horn. And then there's the older ones, often referred to as Minotaur lords, who are much larger and darker in fur color. They've also got darker horns that sort of stand much taller and look much sharper and honed than those of regular Minotaurs. I mean, they're almost in a completely different alignment. It almost makes me think that these two are like different subtypes or something, rather than the same breed of Minotaur at different stages of life. Although, what do I know? I'm just a YouTube lore guy. Anyway, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Minotaurs possess little more intelligence than, say, goblins or ogres, and indeed, you'd even be right, because in present day, at least of Oblivion, Minotaurs are about on par with the goblins, grummites, and ogres in intellect, but that wasn't always the case. They were once just as intelligent and prominent in Cyrodiil as any of the other races are in present-day Cyrodiil. But something happened, or rather a series of things, but they resulted in the Minotaurs devolving into the ones that we know from the games. See, they were once just another sophisticated race, but now these dudes are like literally classified as monsters. The Minotaurs have quite an ancient history that can easily be missed if you don't read the in-game books. And it goes all the way back into the days of Alessia and her slave uprising against the Ayleids. So in her campaign, Alessia received divine aid in the form of two main companions, the time-traveling, elf-hating Terminator-style killbot known as Pellinal Whitestrake, and the demigod Morahouse, the Breath of Kine. Morahouse was a winged bull and the son of Kine, the Nordic aspect of the imperial divine Kinnereth. And after their successes against the Ayleids, Morahouse would become Alessia's first consort. And that's right, one of the first emperors of Cyrodiil, or at least one of its first kings, was a winged bullman. Now, never mind that there are literally statues of Morahouse in Cyrodiil where he's depicted as a man. That is merely a hint at the level of societal erasure that the Minotaurs have undergone in the continent of Tamriel, and more specifically the province of Cyrodiil and the Niben area. Anyway, Alessia and Morahouse, they were married, and their union produced a son named Belharza. Belharza is known as the father of Minotaurs because after their divine union, after he was produced, Minotaurs began, appearing in the lands of Cyrodiil, and like again, more specifically the Niben area, and they began serving the fledgling Alessian dynasty. Now, some scholars argue that Minotaurs definitely existed before this, but if they did, they weren't directly serving men because there was no empire of men. It was an empire of Ayleids, Daedra-worshipping insane elves who, if the Minotaurs were as sophisticated as they seemed to be back then, they would have wanted nothing to do with. So it is up for debate if, the divine union of Alessia and Morahouse literally created the Minotaur race. I mean, I guess it is possible. He was the son of Kine, the divine that has the most to do with nature, and he was a literal winged bullman, so I guess it is possible that their union would have these metaphysical consequences in the form of producing a new race that sort of was tied to their dynasty. That's not too far out of the realm of possibility as far as the lore of this world. Scholars kind of chalk it up to Morahouse's heritage, the fact that he's part Aedra and he's able to change things through love. In this case, creating a whole new race of bullmen following his union with a human slave queen. Overall, Morehouse is actually a really interesting character. He was the first Alessian emperor consort, and he was a winged bullman demigod. His best friend was a time-traveling murder bot. I mean, that alone is interesting as hell. I think stuff like that is what sets Elder Scrolls lore apart from the other more stock fantasy universes, and just how bizarre it can be at times by its own descriptions. Anyway, you can read more about Morehouse in the adabal-a, where I believe he had this extremely long conversation with Pelennel's severed head after the Terminator got himself cut into eighths by the Ayleid kings of old in response to the amount of death he had brought upon the elf kind as a whole. But in that book, his head chats it up with Morehouse. But obviously at this point in the Alessian dynasty, the Minotaurs enjoyed a pretty chill position as like symbols of the Empire's might, and powerful soldiers and protectors of it, which is why we see Minotaurs way later on down the road in the days of Oblivion, sort of quietly observing and overlooking these ruins of the civilization that their people were once a part of. It's a really interesting thing. But just because they were respected by the establishment of the Empire doesn't mean they were going to be accepted by the population of it. Whether or not they did come from divine origin or not, they were subject to distrust and outright suspicion just based on their appearance. And I have to imagine some individuals probably took issue with the whole divine origin thing, and again, it's possible Minotaurs did exist before Alessia and Morehouse had Belharza, but that ultimately didn't even matter to the people of the Empire. They just didn't like that these giant bullmen were receiving so much praise and respect from, well, their masters. They were also highly resistant to magic, which in a way made them difficult to control. Now, most evidence depicting the Minotaur culture and history of, a time before the Alessian Order arose was effectively destroyed by the Alessian Order when it did arise. Now, for the Minotaurs to fallen so hard, it begs the question, how? How did this happen? How did the Minotaurs go from being a part of the Empire to being literally classified as monsters? And it all really has to do with this guy. Yeah, that's right. That is a monkey wearing a cape. That's Maruk. Maruk was the head prophet and leader of the Alessian Order, a lunatic band of elf-hating fundamentalists who had their own interpretation of the Adric divines, and they sought to make changes when necessary. This is a famous group that did this dance that supposedly removed all of the elven aspects from Akatosh, completely separating it from Oriel, its elven counterpart or its elven interpretation. In doing this dance, they took essentially two aspects of the same god and fully separated them from each other, if that makes sense. Now, the Alessian Order was obviously known as a group of religious extremists. They proposed a theory of a singular one god. It's like this whole thing that I should do a whole video about because it is an interesting topic. But when they took power within the Empire, they established the 7 inflexible doctrines. The most notorious of these were firmly opposed to the elves, and they were basically all kinds of anti-elf religious rules and laws. And again, the 77 inflexible doctrines was filled with stuff like this. So major scholars have contended that the order wasn't restricted to anti-elven sentiment. They believe and assert that its resentful followers applied the doctrines to any non-human races they felt like, including the Minotaurs. And this makes sense due to the pro-human nature of the Alessian Order. Apparently there was one remaining fragment or a piece of evidence from the pre-Alessian Order days. A fragment of this surviving stone tablet is believed to be depicting Belharza the Manbull, the second emperor of the Alessian Empire, Alessia's son from Morehouse. The stone tablet depicts Belharza facing down enemies of some kind, a group of soldiers, and by the cut of their armor and the shape of their spears, many scholars believe these so-called enemies depicted in this carving are actually fanatical precursors of the Alessian troops, early Alessian Order followers. And many have taken this whole tablet to be a sort of depiction of what happened to the Minotaurs at the hands of the Proto-Alessians. They either killed them or drove them off, thus beginning the decline of the race that we see in evidence in this current day. They were effectively reclassified as monsters and put in the same category as ogres and trolls and dreugh. So yes, despite their devotion to the Empire, they were actually turned on and betrayed and persecuted by the very same establishment they had once served, the founders of which are possibly responsible for the Minotaurs' whole creation as a race, so it's a pretty sad story overall. All because a literal lunatic monkey who heard voices managed to take power with his followers in the Empire. But you know what? Try as they might, the Alessian Order was wholly incapable of wiping out the Minotaurs. So they settled for wiping out their cultural identity and effectively excluding them from society for long enough to the point where they developed their own tribal and primitive society outside that of the greater one, and the rest is history. There'd probably be no reason for the Minotaur to reintegrate as far as they're concerned, and honestly I don't think the other races would even let them at this point. They've been classified as monsters for too long. That's pretty much all they're seen as nowadays. Which is a shame, because if you look at the Oblivion Crisis, when the gates to hell opened up all across the Cyrodiilic homeland and Daedra were pouring out, the Minotaurs of the forest were some of the first to meet the interlopers in combat. You can see this all over the place, especially if you're a higher level. You can encounter the forest creatures like Minotaurs, dreugh, and trolls and ogres battling against the Daedra of Oblivion. And the Minotaurs, they can usually put down quite a few Daedra before they themselves are taken out, especially the lords. So the Alessians doing this massive injustice to the Minotaurs actually had all these negative effects way down the road, because if Minotaurs had still been a part of Cyrodiilic society, they would have, I like to think they would have helped with the whole Oblivion Crisis. I'm not going to say they would have overturned it or went into the gates like the Argonians did, but they certainly would have been more help if they weren't just stuck out in the woods helping the other forest creatures. Although that being said, it's good they were out there to do that. There are some other surviving records of Minotaurs playing a part in some of the iterations of the Empire following the fall of the Alessian one, mainly during the rule of Raymond Cyrodiil, at least the first. They're mentioned in what some might describe as the Holy Texts, the Reminata and the Shawnee Edda, which detail the origins of a young Raymond Cyrodiil. At one point or another, Raymond is described as having a bunch of Minotaurs as part of his royal court, and the room was so hot and sweaty that you could see their tails swatting at the flies that buzzed around everywhere. It's a really gross sight. So at the very least, we know some of them were still civilized by the time of Raymond, because we are still talking about something that happened like centuries ago. In Raymond's preposterous origin tale, the Minotaurs are described as teamsters. So at least 300 years after the fall of the Alessian Order, the Minotaurs still hadn't fully, devolved as a species. In fact, at this point in history, it seemed that they were associated in the freight business of hauling goods, and they even formed labor unions if the term teamster is to be taken seriously. But it appears that this race-wide de-evolution must have happened sometime following the fall of the Raymond dynasty. But the oppression and the distrust definitely happened before. Overall, if the fundamentalists hadn't so thoroughly persecuted the Minotaurs, then I imagine they'd be looked at as one of the more civilized beast races. They'd probably face less discrimination than the orcs do, who, again, the orcs aren't actually beast folk, they just are seen as such by most. The Minotaurs had their close ties with Cyrodiil as a land and the proto-imperials that helped found it. I like to think that that would give them an advantage over some of the other more distrusted races of the time. Although unfortunately for them, they were very successfully monsterized by the cape-wearing guerrillas Alessian Order for a long enough time that the damage done to them as a race appears to be irrevocable. Although they do still show signs of a collective remembrance for their past greatness, if however fleeting, as they can often be spotted looking over the old ruins of the Alessian Empire. And you gotta be careful when observing the Minotaurs, because they seem like the noble savages they appear as right until they bash your skull into mush with one of those fine, well-crafted hammers of theirs. That's another thing, they always have these really fine, well-crafted hammers that they either took from people they killed or perhaps forged themselves. But yeah, I think Minotaurs, they aren't to be approached unless you're hunting them for their horns. What civility they once possessed is long gone now. They don't even appear to be able to speak, which I imagine means they don't write either, which would put their intelligence as beneath that of at least a Cyrodiilic troll, who we know some of which can write. judging by that suicidal one under the bridge. But overall, I wanted to keep this brief. I wanted this to be one of my shorter videos, and I think that's everything I wanted to cover when it comes to the Minotaurs as a whole. And I do hope I didn't go too off on tangents and make it all confusing. I'm thinking of doing some more of these shorter videos on important parts of the lore in both, Elder Scrolls and Dark Souls and various different things. I'm going to branch out to The Witcher, Fallout, all that good stuff as well. But as far as Elder Scrolls topics and Soulsbornian, please let me know in the comments what you guys would think. What would be some suggestions on some topics you'd like to hear me cover? Because I have a list of ideas, but it's always nice to get some feedback from the audience, from the listeners. But as always, if you like the video, please like it. If you dislike it, please dislike it. If you like hearing me ramble on, please consider subscribing. We've got plenty more to come. And if for whatever reason you feel like supporting the channel, I'm going to try to remember to link my Patreon in the description. But other than that, let's have our outro and then some final thoughts, shall we? So cringe. Can you believe this guy actually hits his bong when he's making a video and then leaves it in? What is he, 13? Because there's always so many people who misinterpret my outros as being some sort of weed-related bong hit of some kind, when in reality it is just me huffing fumes in my alchemy lab. That's really all it is. It's actually much better than bong hits. It gets me much more in the proper mind state to make these videos. That's not to say I don't partake in the bong, but I just felt a clarification was in order. Anyway, though, I have a couple upcoming ideas for these shorter videos, but as for the longer ones, that Dark Souls 2 enemies video, it's still coming. It's just a pain in the ass to edit. It's super long, so there's that. But I've also been thinking maybe I should do a video on the lore of the lands of Dark Souls 2, because each of the maps and area zones, they're kind of rich with lore on monsters, items, and events that happen. So that might be fun to cover, and it might not require so much editing. So look to that in the future. But there are some things that will inevitably come out first, like my video on the knights, Artorias, Ornstein, all those people from Dark Souls 1, and then I have another video about the Lothric royal family. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Plus there's more Elder Scrolls stuff to follow, like Dagoth, Mehrunes Dagon, the Dreugh. There's a lot of big plans that don't require so much complex editing that always seems to wig me out, But I am trying to keep this video on the shorter side, so I think I'm going to leave you guys here, and hopefully you'll be hearing from me very, very soon with another either short video or maybe one of the long ones will be finished. But I am trying to get back to my old schedule, so let's hopefully get back to that. Anyway, until then, I hope everybody is safe, and I will see you next time. So yeah, see ya.